Council of State Governments webinar on renewable energy and its impacts on southern state economies. My name is Jeremy Williams, and I am the Energy and Environment Policy Analyst with CSG's Southern Regional Office, also known as the Southern Legislative Conference, in Atlanta, Georgia. Thank you all for taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us here today. We hope this webinar will provide some valuable information that may help you understand the role of renewable energy plays in southern states, what impacts it has on economic development, namely job creation, and what impacts such projects will have as the country moves towards economic recovery. Before we begin, I did want to mention that you're in listen-only mode. If you'd like to submit a question, please type that in the question box in the GoToWebinar toolbar on your screen, and you may do so at any time during the presentations. We'll try to get to as many of those as possible following the presentations, but if we fail to get to your question, we'll certainly make sure it gets forwarded on to the appropriate presenter so that they might follow up with you later. Also note that we'll be recording this event, and it will be available on the CSG website at knowledgecenter.csg.org. That's Knowledge Center spelled out, knowledgecenter.csg.org. And I believe you can look for it online by the middle of next week. It takes a few days for us to format and post it, but it should be available within a few business days. I believe you can look for it about Tuesday. Nationally, renewable energy accounts for almost half of all new power generation capacity in the United States. Businesses and states are capitalizing on this shift, and while the U.S. has lost upwards of 7 million manufacturing jobs over the last decade, manufacturing for clean energy technologies, such as large photovoltaic cell plants, is one sector that continues to show great promise. According to the Solar Foundation's annual National Solar Jobs Census Report, the rate for solar jobs alone could be growing as fast as 36%, and adding an estimated 9,000 workers to the industry every year. Certainly a promising figure. So we'll begin today's event with an overview of what this dynamic looks like, particularly in the South, with a presentation by Mr. Charlie Coggeshall, who is the Renewable Energy Manager with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Following that presentation, we'll turn to a closer look at how specific state policies have promoted renewable industry growth and examine several specific projects in the South. Our second speaker will be Mr. Luke Wilkinson, who is the Project Development Manager with Silicon Ranch Corporation, which is an organization that works with private companies to develop renewable projects by overcoming, among other things, capital cost barriers, and advising those corporations in that regard. I believe he will specifically address at least two major projects in Tennessee and in Georgia. Finally, we'll turn to Oklahoma, where we'll hear from Ms. Tricia Dameron, a Geographic Information System Coordinator and Research Analyst with the State House of Representatives Division of Research. And she will address Oklahoma's efforts to promote development in the state's wind energy sector. I apologize for the brief introductions. I've done so in the interest of time. Links to all our speakers' full biographical information can be found on the advertisement for this event, which is on the main SLC website, slcatlanta.org. So we'll hear from all three speakers, then have time for questions and answers from the audience. Thanks to each of you for being here. We look forward to your presentations. And with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Coggeshall.
Okay, great. Can everybody hear me? Okay, can you all hear me? Well, I'll assume that everyone can hear me. But thanks, Jeremy, and thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this interesting webinar. I'll frame up the topic of renewables and job creation in the South before handing it off to the next speakers. It looks like maybe we're having a little technical. There we go. Okay. Okay. So now we're on the second slide, and I'm hoping everyone can hear me, but I haven't confirmed that yet. But briefly, the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy, or SACE, as it's more commonly known, is an advocacy group based in Knoxville, Tennessee, that's been working throughout the Southeast for over 25 years in supporting the advancement of cleaner and more sustainable energy choices. Next slide. I've been with SACE for almost a year and focused primarily on solar policy and regulatory issues in the Southeast. And prior to joining SACE, I worked with the DOE, United States Department of Energy Sunshot Program. And prior to that, I was a graduate intern at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory while I was working toward an MBA at the University of Denver. Next slide. So I tried to think of this in as blunt a terms as possible, but my goal is that the key message you take from this presentation is that the South, although already experiencing economic and other benefits of wind and solar energy development, has only just begun to scratch the surface on its potential. And more generally, in the next few slides, I'll provide some national and regional context to wind and solar development, both in terms of capacity being built and resulting job and economic development throughout the respective supply chains. And I should note the presentation, I don't hit on biomass, hydro, solar heating and cooling, or other renewable technologies that are also impacting the country and South specifically. Next slide. So we'll start off with wind. In 2012, there was over 13,000 megawatts, or 13 gigawatts, of wind capacity installed in the U.S., accounting for more new generating capacity in 2012 than any other source. So that 13 gigawatts was the result of $25 billion in investments in wind energy projects. At the end of 2012, the cumulative U.S. wind capacity was over 60 gigawatts, equating to about 4% of the U.S. national electricity consumption. Notably, 9 states now rely on wind power for more than 12% of their total annual electricity consumption. Texas had over 12 gigawatts installed by the end of 2012, more than twice the next highest state. And something worth noting is that in May of this year, 2013, ERCOT wind generation hit a record of 28% of ERCOT's load, which is amazing. And on average, I think it's more like 10%. Oklahoma ranked 6th at the end of 2012 for total megawatts installed, and I believe wind generation provides about 10% or more of their load. This explosion in wind energy has been caused in part by policy, particularly renewable portfolio standards, but is increasingly based purely on price, as wind technology and improved supply chain efficiencies are making wind competitive even with low natural gas prices. So after all this rah-rah about wind, you might be wondering why the Southeast remains a white hole in the map that we're looking at right now, and this is actually deceiving. Next slide. The Southeast is clearly behind most parts of the country regarding wind development, but through various means, wind energy, whether developed in the Southeast or imported from elsewhere, is being sought after. The only true utility-scale wind farm currently in existence in the Southeast, so this is not looking at Oklahoma or Texas, is the 29-megawatt Buffalo plant in Tennessee, which you may have noticed on the previous slide. However, technical and design innovations have allowed for larger wind turbines with longer, lighter blades, making wind energy production possible in less windy areas. And as a result, companies have been making proposals and scouting out potential wind development sites in nearly every state in the Southeast. In addition, out-of-state wind PPAs have been signed by TVA, Alabama Power, Georgia Power, and Duke Energy. And I think it's worth noting that the fact that Southern Company is interested in this without any RPS or renewable mandate demonstrates how favorable wind prices have become. Also of note, 2 long-distance transmission lines have been proposed to connect the wind-rich resources from the wind belt of Oklahoma, Kansas, Texas territory to TVA, and another transmission line to connect to Southern Company. Finally, coastal and offshore wind represent some of the greatest renewable resource potential in the Southeast and country for that matter. So we're still 5 to 10 years out from seeing these projects. This is the next generation area that we're on the cusp of. Next slide. And go to the next slide. There we go. So at the end of 2012, the U.S. wind industry supported over 80,000 full-time equivalent jobs directly associated with wind energy project planning, siting, development, construction, manufacturing, and supply chain and operations. Of that, approximately 25,000 were in the manufacturing sector, working at one of 559 wind-related manufacturing facilities, as depicted by the red dots on this map. Of note, 72% of the wind turbine equipment installed in the U.S. last year was made by domestic manufacturers, nearly tripling from 25% in 2006 and 2007. And the South and Southeast are major contributors. Regionally, Texas led the nation in wind jobs with over 10,000 employed in the wind industry in 2012. Oklahoma also has several thousand. Other states have hundreds and in some cases thousands of jobs as well. In all, the businesses in the southern states are now providing goods and services to domestic and international wind industry. And clearly, the Southeast, despite low installed capacity levels, is a major player in the U.S. wind industry. Next slide. Now we'll move on to solar. In particular, I'm going to be referring to solar photovoltaics, or PV. In addition to policy support, significant price drops has fueled an increase in solar adoption across the country. One of the greatest contributors to these price declines has been an oversupply in the market due to an influx of Chinese manufacturing. That has been great for downstream solar industry players, such as installers and developers, and it has also been good for customers, but it has been very hard on manufacturers. That said, this is considered to be a young industry growing pain, and the supply-demand balance appears to be righting itself. This year alone, the industry anticipates adding 4,400 megawatts of PV, bringing the cumulative to over 10 gigawatts, a 30% growth over last year. In 2012, $11.5 billion was invested in solar projects. Next slide. I want to hit on this slide briefly to provide some context for what's happening and where. The figure shows the projected capacity additions for the major state markets this year. So this is forecasted for the end of 2013, what the total capacity will be that each of these major solar markets will be installing. So this isn't cumulative, this is just for the year 2013. But it is actually pretty indicative of the cumulative rankings as well. And as you can see, California's market is several times larger than the second largest market, which happens to be Arizona, and New Jersey is not far behind. The South and Southeast is making strides this year on solar as well, which we'll get into more in a moment. But you can briefly see that North Carolina is a standout, and Georgia, Florida, Texas, and Tennessee are also players. Next slide. Looking at the South more specifically, the left box of cumulative capacity should give you an idea of how southern states compare with each other with regards to market maturity. North Carolina has about twice as much capacity as Texas or Florida, but those states both have over 100 megawatts themselves. A few states have double-digit capacity, and the bulk have 5 megawatts or less, which is really relatively low. All that said, the states that have gotten the greatest attention in the past year have been Georgia and North Carolina. A mix of utility initiatives and regulatory requirements will result in Georgia Power adding nearly 800 megawatts of PV over the next few years. This is from a starting point of only about 10 to 20 megawatts. In North Carolina, currently ranked 5th highest capacity in the country, solar has been booming for years. This is the result of not only price declines, but also policy leadership, the Renewable Portfolio Standard and investment tax credit, both of which the costs are being more than countered by the economic benefits of particularly PV development. Before moving on, I also wanted to hit on something that's been gaining attention across the country and including in the South. Following the release of a report earlier in the year by the Edison Electric Institute, the Utility Trade Association, concerns were raised regarding the increasing presence of distributed generation, particularly PV. Continued price declines have utilities worried that they will lose much-needed electricity payments to customers investing in DG or distributed generation technology. The utilities argue that these customers are being overly incentivized through net metering and other programs, and that as a result, non-PV or non-DG customers are forced to cover the utility costs. So this is something that states working on throughout the Southeast, but our kind of general response and argument and approach on this is that utilities need to first understand the value solar brings to the utility and to the grid and to the customers before inflicting penalties on its use. An issue has been that utilities focus very hard on the cost that they feel they're incurring with increasing DG levels, but they're not putting the same effort into understanding the value, which when quantified can demonstrate not only energy and capacity savings, but also reduce the need for transmission and distribution investments, as well as hedge against energy price volatility and environmental risk and regulation. And this doesn't include other economic and societal benefits which have real value, particularly policymakers. Next slide. Solar brings a massive amount of jobs. While solar electricity generation is only a fraction of that produced by the coal industry, the two industries are actually comparable in the number of jobs they support. Based on a census by the Solar Foundation, there are currently about 140,000 jobs in the solar industry. These are jobs where employees spend at least 50% of their time on solar-related work. But I should note that 90% of those that meet the census solar worker definition, that is spending 50% or more time on solar, actually spend 100% of their time on solar. Broken down, it's the installers that make up the bulk of this labor force, accounting for nearly 50%. Manufacturing makes up about 25%, with sales, project development, and other areas such as accounting making up the rest. In the South, we're experiencing employment gains across sectors. As with wind, there are numerous manufacturing facilities, but as I showed in the previous slide, solar development is also catching on and contributing increasing numbers to the workforce. Based on a review of data collected by SEIA, the Solar Energy Industries Association, I estimated that there's at least 13,000 jobs in the solar industry in the southern states. As an example, in Texas, Florida, and Tennessee in particular, there are over 2,000 jobs per state. And also note over $75 million was invested in each state just towards solar projects on homes and businesses in 2012 alone. There's 100+ people working on solar in just about every single state in the South. Next slide. Before wrapping up, I wanted to hit on a report that was released just a couple days ago. In its second year running, the report titled Solar Means Business. They gather statistics on the companies that are utilizing solar as a competitive advantage in running their operations. From large corporations such as Walmart, Costco, Apple, and IKEA, to small local companies, U.S. businesses are making significant investments in solar to cut energy costs. The figure on the left shows the top 15 companies based on current installed capacity. Walmart has installed solar on their facilities in 11 different states, and they take the cake with nearly 90 megawatts of cumulative capacity. A couple other notables, IKEA, with 35 megawatts, has solar on 89% of their stores across 20 different states. Also noteworthy, you might see Volkswagen there ranked number 14th with just under 10 megawatts. I believe Luke will hit on this, but that 9.6 megawatts, I think, is primarily attributed to a large project that they did in Tennessee. And all these companies and others account for over 3 gigawatts of installed capacity in the U.S. across at least 30 states. The figure in the bottom right shows that this is happening in the South. The colors indicate the different types of buildings where solar is located on, and the size of those bubbles indicates the actual capacity level. And just to give you an idea, blue are corporate offices, green are distribution centers, yellow manufacturing facilities, and red are retail centers. They're not nearly as stacked as the projects in California or in the Northeast. It's clear that companies in the South are making the numbers work to their advantage. Next slide. So to sum it up, wind and solar are already impacting the southern economies. They're bringing thousands of jobs in addition to low risk clean energy. On top of that, the price of these energy sources have dropped so low that it's actually saving ratepayers money. But there is still a ton of untapped resource that can and should be taken advantage of. Policymakers are in a unique position to help facilitate this growth by reducing barriers and encouraging smart long-term investments. Lastly, this Gallup poll conducted in the spring shows that solar and wind are extremely popular with the public across partisan divides. This is a good investment for everyone. Next slide. And that concludes my presentation. Thanks, and I look forward to questions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mr. Coggeshall. You know, one of the awkward things about presenting on a webinar is that you're talking to an audience that you can neither see or, in this case, hear. When you started presenting, everyone else was muted, but we could hear you just fine, and we appreciate that great information. We'll now move immediately to our presentations. I'll turn it over to Mr. Wilkinson.
Thank you, Jeremy. It's very nice to be here. I'm Luke Wilkinson. I'm the Project Development Manager here at Silicon Ranch Corporation. And if we could go to the next slide, we'll get my presentation started. Up, or whenever mine is gets there. There we go. Next slide. We'll start out on who Silicon Ranch is. So Silicon Ranch is a company based out of Nashville, Tennessee, and we provide turnkey renewable energy solutions to customers on kind of their individual needs. We have developed projects with utilities, with companies, you know, such as Volkswagen, Fortune 500 companies, and also on very sensitive company assets such as data centers. And the value that we bring to customers is that we develop and execute these solar solutions for them without having capital costs for them, and that is how we can help companies reach their goals of you know, utilizing solar energy. Next slide. So this is an example of some of the companies that we have helped out. And the great thing is they are as large as, you know, Georgia Power and Volkswagen, but also on a very local level, you can get, you know, the Second Harvest Food Bank, a local nonprofit here in Nashville, and, you know, smaller institutions that want to be in the game as well, but definitely would not be able to have the capital outlay that, you know, Volkswagen or Georgia Power would have. Next slide. So we're going to go over two different case studies that Silicon Ranch has been able to execute, the first one being Volkswagen. Next slide. So Volkswagen started when they decided to choose Tennessee and Chattanooga to build a $1 billion manufacturing and assembly plant. And that was really kind of an interesting development because they were really focused on an environmental sustainability program and creating one of the most environmentally friendly auto manufacturing plants in the world. And it happened at a time where Chattanooga was trying to also kind of redevelop itself as a more environmentally friendly city after they had some negative publicity around their environmental performance. Next slide. So they decided to choose a brownfield site in Chattanooga that had formerly been a munitions factory and building it right beside a nature preserve. And so for every tree that we cut down as part of the construction process, we negotiated with them in the city to have 2 trees planted in replace of that one somewhere within the city. And then Volkswagen actually decided they wanted to become a Platinum LEED certified manufacturing facility. Next slide. And so LEED Platinum has very many challenges on a whole number of fronts for a company. You know, a bunch of environmental, you know, water, energy type goals that they have to meet to be able to get certified. And so as part of that, they needed renewable energy on site. Next slide. They actually needed about 12.5% of their power to be generated on site. And what they did was they worked for a couple years trying to determine what fuel source, wind, solar, biofuels, you know, what would work best for them. But But they also ran into the problem that there was no established utility program in their area that could accommodate such a large amount of renewable energy needed to get 12.5% of their plant. And they were also within the TVA service area, which also presents, very unique challenges since they have certain statutory protections. And so they reached out to Silicon Ranch to help them develop a successful solution to their problem. Next step. Slide, please. So we worked with TVA and a local distributor in Chattanooga to try to find a program within their existing programs, but the size of the energy required was too large to make it practical at the time. So we ended up proposing a behind-the-meter solution that Volkswagen buys power directly from Silicon Ranch, who runs the facility behind their manufacturing plant. And as part of that, they never have to have the middleman of the utility, which has made it an actual practical solution for Volkswagen. And they had to perform due diligence on the concept, on us, and they had to get to the point where they trusted that they could enter into a 20-year power purchase agreement with us and know that we would be able to sell them that power for the entire contract. Next slide. The result has been a 9.5 megawatt system that you can see in the picture that's providing 12.5% of their electricity needs when they're at peak capacity. But one of the great things is when they, are switching, when they turn off their manufacturing facility to change out equipment or do maintenance, it actually provides almost 100% of their power when they're not running, which is something that they've been really excited about. And it allowed them to get their LEED Platinum certification and become the actually only one in the world that's an automotive manufacturing plant with that certification. Next slide. And they have used it to benefit kind of their marketing and of the Passat, which is built in Chattanooga, and they saw an opportunity to say, you know what, we're getting all this clean energy out of this plant. Why don't we build the Passat and be able to market it as the only clean diesel option in the midsize segment, and really combine the two? And they've really gotten a good value out of the PR that they've been able to build between both the cars that they're building there and the solar farm that they use to provide some of that energy. Next slide. The Georgia experience is a very different one. Next slide. It started with Georgia recruited large solar panel manufacturer and commercialized some solar technology out of Georgia Tech, which gave them a great value chain in the solar industry, but they also recognized that they didn't really have a good in-state market to utilize that value chain that they were developing. So the Public Service Commission directed Georgia Power to acquire 50 megawatts of solar in their territory to help develop that value chain even further. Next slide. So Georgia Power decided to award 2 large-scale projects to get to that 50 megawatts. They priced it based on the need for the capacity and the procurement costs, and they negotiated and signed 2 power purchase agreements for those projects. And they used it as a pilot program to kind of structure how a solar program would look for the state of Georgia. And as I'm sure most of you have seen, since then they've announced another 210 megawatts for commercial and utility scale procurement, and then the Public Service Commission also mandated another 250 megawatts of solar for Georgia Power's integrated resource plan. Next slide. And so this is the project that Silicon Ranch has worked on. It's 30 megawatts AC, and this is kind of the time scale and kind of the scale of land that it takes to develop one of these large projects. And fortunately, I can say that it will go online here within the next month and provide and start sending power directly into the grid in Social Circle, Georgia. Next slide. So there was many considerations that both these projects needed. They had to go through many kind of state and local policies, and they needed to find a place where they supported these solar transactions, the power purchase agreement, zoning, And then there's a lot of permitting and local tax policy that comes into play with these deals. And one thing to know is that it takes a lot of work to get an interconnection between the power plant and the end off-taker of that energy. And a small project is just as time-consuming and costly as a large project. So scale is actually very important in the solar energy. The larger you can get, the easier it is to, spread those costs out. And there's lots of legal documents and local knowledge that's in place. And this is where a lot of the value that's not accounted for a lot of times in the solar energy is we use local attorneys, local bankers, because we need them to be able to help us figure out how we can make this deal the best for the locality as well as the end user, whether it be a utility or a corporation or company. Next slide. Next slide. So one thing that we're finding that really benefits kind of the companies in the South is sustainability has been shown to be good business. These companies that have very developed sustainability programs are showing better performance in the stock market, better return on their assets and equity, and it has been shown over a long period of time. So companies are really starting to understand this and want to develop these programs, and they're not always in the best position to come up with solutions in kind of a complex market for solar, especially in the Southeast. Next slide. They do understand, however, that the trends are starting to favor solar, that the economics are becoming more compelling, pretty much everywhere they go, and that the prices are coming down as kind of other fuel costs have been going up, and they like to consider both the energy costs as well as the sustainability benefits that they receive when they are trying to decide where to locate new manufacturing facilities or new distribution centers. And they use that as a way to bring in consumers that are aware of their brand using these solar assets. Next slide. So the objectives of the solar strategy, it really is an opportunity to grow capital investment and jobs in an area. Large-scale projects are really great at what we call moving the needle. They provide great, once you get to the 10 megawatt size projects like Volkswagen, you really generate a lot of media kind of frenzy around it that you don't even have to go seek out. They want to write stories about this type of project. And it's a really great way to drive down the cost by going with these larger scale projects. And there's all sorts of different creative ways that you can use local industry and policy to drive sustainability objectives and recruit these companies to your area. But the one thing that is very key is you really need to have a utility company or this energy distributor that is on board with the planning and the partnership, because they're essential to the entire project. Next slide. So we like to joke that when you've seen one solar deal, you've only seen one solar deal, because every single one is different, and it's very much based on the state and local policy. And it's very important to have both of those policies in line and supportive of a solar strategy. And the main two areas where this is not always clear is companies should not be prohibited from entering into power purchase agreements for on-site generation like Volkswagen is doing in Chattanooga. It's not always clear in all the other states or localities whether they're allowed to do that, and that's often where the local utility comes into play. And not allowing them to do that really takes an advantage away from them, and quite honestly prevents probably some relocation efforts that they might seek out if they don't know if they can do a power purchase agreement behind the meter project. And then the other area is property tax. There's sometimes confusion at the state level and the local level of how property taxes should be assessed on solar assets. And having kind of a uniform guidance on a state level is very, very important, so that solar developers and companies alike can understand how those are going to be taxed. So when they're developing these projects, they know and they can price the deal appropriately. And then also there's some challenges with zoning, permitting, and fees, but those are a little bit easier to navigate than the property tax and the power purchase agreements, because that's where the local, legal knowledge is very, very important and helpful. Next slide. Next slide. So we like to think that there's not too many people walking around like these guys anymore when that beautiful sun is right behind them. Next slide. And this is kind of some additional information of how Germany looks and how solar is very helpful in kind of evening out that base load that you see at the bottom by really spiking and coming online during the peak hours of the late morning through the afternoon. Next slide. And then one last slide just showing that the time for solar energy and other renewables is now. This just shows the price of some fossil fuels is increasing over time while the price of the renewables is coming down, and they're close to overlapping, and eventually the renewable energy space will hopefully be less than traditional fossil fuels. Next slide. And we are always available for discussions on solar energy. We're based in the Southeast. That's where we've done all our business to date, and so we would love to hear from any of you. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson. Excellent presentation. We'll go ahead and move to our final presentation before we open the floor for questions and answers. So now we have Ms. Tricia Dameron.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm going to give a brief overview of wind energy in Oklahoma. Next slide, please. The Panhandle of Oklahoma has been called the motherlode of wind in this country. According to the Oklahoma Wind Power Initiative, the first Oklahoma wind farm was operational in September 2003, and by the end of 2009, there were 11 fully operational wind farms in Oklahoma with a total approximate capacity of 1,030 megawatts. You can see in the map that the highest wind speeds are in the western half of the state, and indeed all of Oklahoma's wind farms are west of Interstate 35, which runs north-south through the middle of the state. Next slide. Oklahoma's current capacity for wind generation is a little more than 3,000 megawatts, and it should be noted that last year the capacity grew by 50%. Oklahoma was one of 4 states to add over 1,000 megawatts of capacity in 2012, and the growth continues. Just last week, Public Service Company of Oklahoma, one of the state's largest utilities, signed an agreement to buy 600 megawatts of power from 3 new wind farm projects in the Oklahoma Panhandle, and those are expected to be online in 2015. This follows an April 2012 settlement between the EPA and PSO. In order to comply with the agency's regional haze rules, the utility volunteered to retire 2 coal-burning units by the end of 2026. In other news, this summer, Clean Line Energy Partners announced a plan to build a transmission line from northwest Oklahoma to Memphis, Tennessee, and it will reportedly transmit 3,500 megawatts of wind-generated power to market. I'll talk a little bit more about transmission initiatives in a few minutes. Next slide. There have been no formal studies to quantify the economic impact of the wind energy industry in Oklahoma, and statewide employment figures in the press range from 2,000 to 5,000 jobs. But last year, wind energy generated about $20 million in ad valorem taxes and $10 million in land royalty payments. The economic impact surrounding wind farms is significant, especially notable in the immediate surrounding communities. Advancing Wind, a wind energy advocacy group in Oklahoma, said that the construction of a 200-megawatt wind farm in central Oklahoma in 2010 generated 468 jobs and close to $8 million in wages. In addition to the construction jobs, more than 600 operation and maintenance jobs will be created over the next 20 years, generating more than $187 million in local economic activity. Next slide. Earlier this week, with the announcement of the PSO deal I mentioned, the TradeWinds CEO said that Oklahoma's natural resources and the leadership of lawmakers have made it an ideal state for wind energy investment. The state's thoughtful policies have helped encourage development of a resource that is mutually beneficial to ratepayers, local communities, and the environment. Next slide, please. So, what policy is Rob Friedman referring to? For starters, in 2010, the Oklahoma legislature attempted to provide some guidance for wind farm owners and landowners to specify the rights and responsibilities of each. They passed House Bill 2973, known as the Oklahoma Wind Energy Development Act, which provides rules related to decommissioning, payments, and insurance. Within 1 year of abandonment of a project, equipment from wind energy facilities must be removed and the land must be returned to its condition prior to the facility construction, except for roads. After 15 years of operation, wind energy facility owners must provide an estimate of the decommissioning costs, as well as proof of financial security to cover the cost of decommission. For any wind energy facility that makes payments to the landowner dependent upon the amount of electricity produced, facility owners are required to provide an explanation of the payment calculation to the landowner and allow for landowners to confirm the accuracy of payments and inspect records and make the records available to the state. Wind energy facilities must have commercial general liability insurance, which must name the landowner as an insured party. Proof of such insurance must be provided to the landowner before construction begins. In addition to the Wind Energy Development Act, Oklahoma that year also passed Senate Bill 1787, which states that access to the airspace is tied to the ownership of the land, and that any wind or solar leasing arrangements associated with the airspace must be made with the landowner that owns the land below the air. Oklahoma also has the Zero Emissions Facility Tax Credit, which was enacted in 2002, and this year the legislature extended the credit to 2021. The credits will no longer be transferable after December 31 of this year, and the carryover provision will only apply to those credits earned prior to January 1, 2014. Beginning January 1, 2014, the credits will be refundable for up to 85% of its value. Also, we have the Investment in New Jobs Tax Credit. This credit is available to manufacturers and can be earned through investment in depreciable property or by adding full-time equivalent employees involved in manufacturing. $50,000 is the minimum investment required, and the credit doubles in enterprise zones or if the investment exceeds $40 million. Lastly is the 5-year ad valorem tax exemption. And to qualify, a manufacturing company, including wind, can forego paying ad valorem taxes for a period of 5 years through the building of new, expanded, or acquired manufacturing facility and equipment. Next slide, please. And then we also have the Oklahoma Energy Security Act, which set a goal that 15% of all installed electric generation capacity within the state be generated from renewable energy sources by 2015. And last week at the state's energy conference, Governor Mary Fallin said that Oklahoma is ahead of schedule on our goal, and a big reason for this is our strong wind energy sector. And the Corporation Commission reported that last year the state's percentage of renewable energy was 17.27%. The Oklahoma Energy Security Act also seeks to facilitate wind energy development by directing the Corporation Commission to work with the Southwest Power Pool to develop a plan to expand future transmission capacity. And the Commission will report on the progress early next year, with the final report issued in or by January 1, 2020. Next slide, please. Well, that concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Dameron. And thanks to each of our speakers for your informative talks. We still have a few minutes before the close of the hour. I believe we have a few questions from the audience. First of all, to provide context, can one of the panelists please indicate how many households can be powered with 1 megawatt of power? Correct me if I'm wrong. I was thinking about 1 megawatt of power produce electricity for about 1,000 homes. If a home is using 10,000, approximately 10,000 kilowatt hours, a year. Is that ballpark? Is that about right?
This is Charlie. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Hey, well, it depends on the technology, and I think, and also on the resource, like where you're located. But for solar, because it's not going to be running 24/7, and there's a capacity factor where it's providing energy, for a certain chunk of the day when the sun's shining, and not throughout the entire duration of the day. I think 1 megawatt of solar on average, it depends how you do these different calculations. I think everyone's got a different idea of, or a different methodology for it, but I think it would be probably more like between 100 and 300 homes for projects in the southeast, and it'd probably be on the upper end of that for when you go towards the southwest, and on the lower end and kind of less well-resourced areas from a solar irradiance perspective. And then my sense is that wind would probably be a little more than that, like closer to 500 or 400 homes, whereas like a coal plant or a base load plant that's going to be running, like nuclear plant, which is going to be running like 90% efficiency for the entire year nonstop, that would be closer to 800 to 1,000 customers. But the other panelists might have more insight on that.
I don't have anything to add.
Yeah, same here. It's about that for solar.
Okay, great, thanks. We have one other question about. No, go ahead.
I'll add just that sometimes I think that can be used to kind of ding solar or ding wind or ding kind of these resources that aren't necessarily going to be operating at full capacity all day or for the entire duration of the year. But I think it's worth noting that the prediction levels are fairly high, even though, as you say, it's intermittent and you don't know when you can kind of anticipate that generation. But when you look at sort of aggregate levels for both wind and for solar across a larger area, the forecasting for it becomes much more straightforward. And I think on solar, I like to note in particular, too, that generation is occurring at the highest kind of peak demand period. So it's when people are kind of needing the energy the most is when energy is being produced at the highest level. So I think there's different values that you can place on that energy. It's not one electron isn't necessarily equal to any other electron. There are different parts of the day and stuff that can kind of change the playing field a little bit.
All right, that's great. Thanks for that clarification. I have one other question about, and it's I guess this can be directed to any of the panelists. We've talked a lot about large-scale solar, wind. This is a question about small-scale algae-based diesel, cellulosic ethanol. These are types of things we've seen to some extent come and go. What expectations and confidence can policymakers have going forward with these technologies? What role will they play, if any? Will they have any major impact in renewable energy capacity in the South or nationally?
And so, if you repeat like which technologies you refer to as like the distributed generation, but for biofuels.
They listed biofuel, cellulosic, biobutanol. I guess smaller scale renewable projects.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's the biomass side, at least for states, and I think this is something I guess I should say that I can follow up with you on. We do have a energy manager in the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy that focuses 100% on biomass. And then we also do have a small segment that actually looks at biofuels as well. But I could reach out to them to, or connect you, whoever's asking the question, to follow up to provide an answer to that. 'Cause that's not an area that I'm as well equipped to respond to.
Sure. Okay, I think that's the end of the questions. We've got a few more minutes, but we'll, if we have any other questions, we'll certainly forward them along to the panelists. In closing, I'd like to thank all of our panelists again for your excellent presentations. We appreciate you taking the time and work putting this information together, and for taking time this afternoon to share it with us. Again, just a reminder to the audience that if you know someone who is unable to join us, or if you wish to return to some of the information presented today, the webinar will be available at knowledgecenter.csg.org just within a few business days. We post these events as YouTube videos, which include obviously the audio, but also the PowerPoint slides. So they're very accessible. You can easily forward them along to whomever you like, and you can essentially revisit any portion of the webinar through CSG's Knowledge Center. Before we close, I wanted to again thank the audience for joining us this afternoon. I hope you found the information useful. And again, if you have any subsequent questions, please don't hesitate to send them along to me at jlwilliams@csg.org. That's jlwilliams@csg.org. I'd also like to say a quick thanks to Carrie Abner and the other CSG staff for their technical support, as well as for their assistance in advertising and helping to organize this event. Thanks again to our presenters and to everyone for joining us. Have a pleasant afternoon.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.